All right. Hi, Henry. It's been a long time. 2 weeks is like forever in crypto, right? How are you doing?
Fantastic. I'm excited about this. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I regret not doing it last week, but that's life. That's life. Could you give us some updates on what you've been up to over the last couple of weeks?
Absolutely. So great news was selected by the Refinable art curation team as one of the first creators to come on to the space in beta. The beta of their main net is going live, and there was a voting process um, through their community of about 100,000 members, and was one of the artists that received the most votes to be selected as an artist on the site. So that is great news. Been working on developing a portfolio for the launch. Next week, I have a phone interview, or not interview, but conversation or dialogue with one of the art curators for Refinable. He'll be calling from the West Coast of the United States, I believe, probably Tuesday, and to discuss their objectives, what is the process that they're developing to market and develop their NFT artist portfolios. Probably going over a little bit about, the timeline of what I'm launching, and maybe there may be some curatorial suggestions by them. And so we'll be looking at portfolios and things like that. And that will all happen next week. Probably we'll go live with some early minting offers on Refinable and beta beginning, I would say, if not the end of next week, early in the week to follow.
Cool, cool. Congrats. You said there's a lot of people trying to get on there, right? But you were one of the lucky ones. That's awesome.
Yeah. So for now, it's all representation basis. So like they're selecting artists to be represented by Refinable at this phase. And I do believe that at some point in the future, that in mainnet, it's going to be a public marketplace similar to Rarible, in that you can come on, and until you're verified, your sort of public identity will remain somewhat off the grid, and then you apply for verification. So this stable of artists that are coming under Refinable now essentially are the verified artists, the first verified artist group to come on.
There's Rarible. I'm more familiar with that one, and then there's Refinable. What does the name mean, or how is it that much different from Rarible? Is their take on it completely different, or you think it's going to end up being about the same at the end?
Well, it really depends on the functionality, what their focus ends up being. I mean, there's so many ways to look at these different sites, and I think they're all sort of in development phase. I mean, without a doubt, they are, and they're all trying to define their identity, and they're taking suggestions from creators, which is wonderful. I work hand in hand with the CEO of Uptick a lot, and he takes a lot of suggestions from the community to heart. And I think Refinable is going to do the same thing. Rarible, being sort of like first to the market as a dominant public space, they came on very early and very strong, and justifiably they own the marketplace, but by volume, and that's probably going to continue for some time. I don't think that Refinable is trying to be Rarible. I think they're going to focus more on fine art creators than what you see on Rarible, which is a bit of a wild, wild west where everybody comes on and does what they want. And about 90% of the creators on there are sort of similar in that they're focused on collectibles like trading cards, fashionista, like the cyberpunks, pixelated critters and whatnot, like the crypto kitties. That's sort of the traditional collectible that you could have bought in the analog world. Well, here now it is available in the digital world, and that's what you're seeing mostly on Rarible. But Uptick is looking to be very much sort of compartmentalized, where they have focus categories, and one of them happens to be tickets online, and ways in which digitizing and monetizing experiences in the analog world. So like events and things like that, where you're able to mint and monetize experiences. So there's one focus with an uptick. And then you have a less developed, what do you call it? The sort of arena of the artist, minting art. That's, I believe, uptick is going to have a strength there, because it seems like the majority of people that have moved on to uptick are in their own way more traditional fine artists, and they're digitizing and trying to monetize their work and their portfolios. So I don't see a lot of the collectible tradables on uptick so far. It does have a much smaller crowd visiting it, but that's all going to change in the near future. And then Refinable, again, I really see this as the way in which they came out of the gate, developing a stable of artists to verify and focus on, really leads me to believe that their main focus is going to be more like super rare, or a foundation platforms that are hyper focused on, drops, in marketing the drops, and having a stable of represented artists and building their careers with them hand in hand. So it's a lot of familiarity for me as coming from the analog world as an artist. That's what galleries do. They build relationships with artists, they represent those artists, and they try to develop their careers to benefit everybody involved.
A couple of follow-up questions there. Refinable, is that going to be using Ethereum, or do they have a native token, or how does the gas work on Refinable?
So they have a native token. It's called Fine. Right now, really the only place that you can buy Fine is on PancakeSwap. That's all going to change very quickly. The Refinable is on the Binance Smart Chain. It's the first NFT marketplace that's going to be launching on in partnership with Binance. Ches, the CEO from Binance, is an investor in Refinable, as is Mr. Beast, who's a bit of a YouTube star. If you ask your children, they probably know who Mr. Beast is, but he's a very, very popular YouTube star, and he's an investor and an influencer who's working with Refinable. But the gas is going to be fine, but the purchase of work on Refinable is going to be with BNB. So if you wanted to buy work on Refinable, or you want, as an artist, want to mint works for sale on Refinable, you're going to do that with Binance Coin, and it's the smart chain Binance Coin, the BEP20.
Okay, and there was one other thing I wanted to confirm. You said you often speak with the CEO of Uptick, and you said you're expecting some changes. Is there anything you can talk about there? Are they going to step up the marketing, or have you heard anything?
All I can say right now is that the phase of marketing the project out of testnet into more of a beta solution that is then available to the masses, that we're entering that phase. So Uptick is actually really fantastic in the way that I've almost, it seems like twice a week now, we're getting updates that are streamlining issues or elaborating on functionality, and I'm really, really impressed with Uptick. They're doing a fantastic job. I do know for a fact that they're about to head into a phase of marketing the sort of the next step, which is going to be kind of a beta offered to the public. They've really limited, over the last 6 to 8 weeks that I've been working with Uptick, they've really limited the amount of activity that's going on, and they're not advertising what they're doing at all. And that's about to change. So that's about to the extent in which I could speak to that.
Okay, I think I noticed, I don't know, in the last week or so, you're going to meet with the psychology department at John Fisher College in New York. Can you tell us how that went?
Yeah. So I have actually had a working relationship with this university for several years. Um, being a post-traumatic disorder sufferer most of my adult life, and the way in which art has always functioned as an externalization therapy for myself, meaning I have utilized my own artistic process as also a therapeutic healing process. And in doing that over all these years, I sort of developed a lot of insight about how it can be effective. And maybe about 4 years ago, my therapist at the time was also one of the psychologists a professor of psychology at St. John Fisher College. He had asked me if I would be willing to come and work with his grad level classes in discussing both my process and how I utilized it personally, and ways in which young psychotherapists coming out of university could utilize art as a therapeutic approach, especially when dealing with trauma sufferers. The main concern with trauma sufferers is this kind of isolation and repression, especially of the experience. And so, that the repression of what happened is really vital to understanding the sort of like the symptoms of PTSD sufferers, and what they call intrusive thoughts or suicidal ideation, the intense levels of depression that can be experienced. That most of that stems from repression. So when you work with traditional like when you say you work with a veteran of war coming back from a theater in Iraq or whatever, and they've had trauma, it's extremely important that they externalize and get to a point where they can comfortably externalize and work through what they call in the therapy models as sort of like stuck points, right? The things that you believe to be true that may not be true necessarily, but it's all sort of folds into your psychoses. So that being said, as I started to work with the grad level classes about the output, the throughput of pain, suffering, ideation, all that which a PTSD sufferer, trauma sufferer would be hyper focused on and being debilitated by, I was able to express and explain and teach these young psychotherapists in training how to work with their patients with an art as therapy. So that's how the relationship began with the university. And I several times a year, I go in and give workshops for the students. So that has developed into there's a great need in therapy for visual models or reference models, reference expressions of these internalized experiences, whether you're dealing with human sexuality, the positive and the negative side of that, or depression, the positive, the negative, suicide. I mean, in every example of mental health across the world through all genders. I mean, you could be talking about, what it means to be, a transgender, non-binary, and what is the experience in a public space with regards to, the ways in which society treats them and how that affects their psychology. So when you think about the whole concept of mental health, or the whole arena of mental health, there's an endless array of situations that have very specific dynamics. And so if I'm a therapist and I say I'm speaking with a patient and specifically to their life circumstance, that what's happening in their head, there is a narrative that a therapist will develop with the patient around their experience of their mental health as it's deteriorated wherever it is in the moment. That narrative that develops around the sufferer's experience has within it a whole array of sort of like expressive points, right? I could say that somebody might say, well, I'm depressed and it feels like, I'm completely isolated. I'm, I can't hear anybody talk outside myself. I can't get out of bed. So these are all like sort of key points in the narrative. So what they want me to do is they're going to take this idea of narrative prompts. We're going to take the idea of a narrative prompt where a patient, a professor, a student at the grad level, they're going to develop around some particular mental health issue, a narrative prompt for me then to take and create an interpretive work that will then become cataloged as a visual representation of that mental health concern. And the reason for this is that there is no catalog that exists at the moment at the university level for them to work with in ways in which are sort of unique and outside the box, right? It's a way of developing for the university system in the abstract, a way to build dialogues around the mental health issues in class, right? So it's basically as it's conceived now, and I imagine that it's going to develop further. This catalog, which will be built in an online way, where any student could access it, with knowledge that it exists, and that it could be used as part of the curriculum in many creative ways, which are, the development of how this catalog of visual references to the narrative prompts is going to develop use cases. That's ongoing. So from there, once we develop the catalog, which is going to be ongoing as of now, I've already received a series of prompts from grad level therapists who are working with teenagers with mental health issues. And they sat down and gave me my first 3 prompts, which I'll be working on this upcoming week for the university. So that's exciting. But from there, I guess essentially it's a pilot program right now that's going to be developed at St. John Fisher, with the goal of moving that pilot program to, of access made available to all university systems around the United States and internationally. And my main contact with St. John Fisher is he's a Ugandan native who moved here to go to university and has remained here his whole adult life. But he works in Uganda every summer. In Uganda, for people who don't know, is like many countries in Africa, at the tail end of a 2.5 decades long civil war, probably 10 years removed since the last, real violence. And the country is in tatters, and it has a population that's probably in the 60-70% of which has post-traumatic stress disorder because of the Civil War. And there's a complete lack of psychotherapists. There's a lack of professionals to deal with the problem there. So everything that we're doing as a pilot program at St. John Fisher is also being considered as a something to be brought over to Uganda and its neighbors for their therapists to work with in these war-torn countries. So it's a lot of lofty goals right now. But because my whole life has sort of been in and out of the mental health system, and I've, worked through my own traumas successfully, it just, naturally and organically grew out of my efforts to share how art has helped me and saved my life.
It's really interesting. Okay. A couple things I want to confirm there. So When you were talking about the catalog, what came to my mind was sort of like, in the movies, they're looking for the bad guy and there's all the mug shots. So this catalog would be like several images that you created, and the person who needs help would point at a picture that best describes how they're feeling or what their condition is. And then the psychologist or psychotherapist would be able to work from there because it's hard to communicate exactly how one feels. Am I on the right track?
Yeah, interestingly, yes. I mean, that's a track. So again, like that it's a pilot right now. All of the ways in which, like, it's use cases, as we can refer to as use cases. It's going to be sort of like twofold right now. Immediately, I could say, yeah, on the one hand, you're going to have this catalog that will be utilized by therapists in training as a way to dig deeper into mental health concerns. So, like, let's say the catalog will have, it's going to be compartmentalized, right? You'll have like situational depictions of, what is experienced by people with bipolar disorder, people with schizophrenia, people with borderline personality disorder, severe depression, suicidal ideation, intrusive thoughts, racing thoughts. And those prompts that will come for me to interpret visually will be fleshed out more so than just depression, right? It'll have some sort of like metaphorical suggestion as to what people are experiencing, right? Most people, when they talk about their mental health with their therapist, it's hard to say literally what you're experiencing. So there's going to be a lot of sort of like colorful language that's part of these prompts that I'm working from. Then, as you said, that is one way that it could be utilized in practice, right? Is you could open up the catalog or sit with your patient. You could go through this catalog and try to find sort of things that relate, that they'll identify with visually. And, a great many people in this world can't find words to say what they wish they could say, especially in a therapist's office. It's sort of like, by its very nature, difficult to discuss because your whole identity is wrapped up in a particular pain or a particular psychodynamic, and it's sort of like, you're in that cage and it's very difficult to get out of it. So in this one way, it's sort of like, yes, here are prompts. This is a place where we can start dialogue, which is what art is for. So ideally, this catalog of work that I create is going to be dramatic enough and relevant enough in its relatability that it could help prompt dialogues in practice, to your point.
And it'd be cross-cultural too, right? You could use it in any country. It's really cool, and collect all the data, and it's awesome.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, I'm, as much as I am going to work diligently to fill out this catalog, it is also something that I'm going to pass on as a torch. So once it's fully developed as a system, so to speak, or an academic tool, or a tool for practice in therapy, that at that point, I would expect that the moment it leaves, the pilot program at St. John Fisher and becomes accessible by other universities, that those universities could then, and I think this is going to be part of the project, that other artists would come in and further develop the catalog, right? So obviously, I'm not going to be the sole artist responsible for developing this catalog forevermore. But the whole concept doesn't exist, only it's coming to be now. So we need to really figure out the sort of infrastructure and how, once handing it over to another university, or giving other universities access to it, that folded into that offering, folded into that whole tool, that whole package, is how they go about bringing other creators into the fold, if that's something that they want to do or have access to, right? So it's layers and layers of complexity right now. But again, it's just in its inception, and we're working on building this pilot.
It's exciting. And I was just thinking, like, there's so much stigma about mental health that if this is, available online at some point, people that are afraid to talk about how they're feeling could, maybe get some advice and see, other people that sort of identified with the same image, it'd be a starting point at least to get some help. It's good.
Yeah. Public access is definitely in the mix. And again, it's just really figuring out right now the foundational steps that we need to take. And, in an organization, how do we organize it online? Obviously, the catalog is going to need to be digital, but there's room for physical catalogs. Having like a textbook, so to speak, could be created from the catalog. Or you could do individual chapters of a textbook that are all focusing sort of like the structure of the online catalog will just be sort of reflected in the academic catalog. So it's amazing. I definitely consider it part of my life's work, and I'm looking forward to it, but we have a lot of work to do. Lots of work to do.
Okay, thank you for that. Before we move on and talk about art, are there any other updates you want to talk about? I don't know if there's a new project you're working on that you haven't mentioned, or something in the pipeline you want to let us know about.
So, I've been thinking a lot about this culture of influencers, and it's really fascinating to me that how does one go about becoming an influencer? Is it personality? Is it time and place? You knew the right people? Was something did you hit on a viral something earlier on, and that led to the development of your significant following? There's something fascinating about the idea of the influencer. And so I would say if there was a new project, it's just that I've been sort of like interpreting influencers out of a fascination for the idea, because their identity is all, online, it's in social media, but their voice is more than the sort of disenfranchised, masses. I mean, they've risen above the fray, and so I feel like they're worthy of my focus. And so I have been building a collection of interpretations of celebrity and influencers. I have a lot of different projects that are going right now. I had created a body of work around climate crisis. I'm a big fan of Greta Thunberg, and so I had developed this project for her foundation, and there's 8 works. Each of the work is sort of variations on a theme that uses as its subject matter, believe it or not, the mummified corpse of a red fox, and how I could use that symbol of, death in nature as a way of commenting on all of the many ways in which, man in the Anthropocene, or, man's impact on nature is unfolding at this ridiculous clip that it is. And, everything to me feels apocalyptic with regards to, our impact on nature. So, I developed that series. I offered it to the foundation as something that they could auction off to raise money for their goals, their work around the world. And they said that they would absolutely love to participate and help market such an auction, but they do not have the technical savvy or understanding of the NFT market at the moment. So that's something I'm going to be thinking about probably for the summer, how to develop a auction. And now that I'm working with Refinable, or Uptick, depending on where they are, probably one of these platforms that I have been developing relationships with, I'm going to see if there's a way in which we can get this like an international auction off, where all the proceeds will be donated to Greta Thunberg's foundation. So that working. Yep. The Elemental Elegies is for the moment on hold. And when we start moving into the conversations about art, I'll explain more about so sort of what's going on and why it's going on.
Yeah, I was going to move on to the art, but just now you mentioned climate change and that, and later on I was going to ask you, I don't know if it's too complicated to just list them off, but what are the social justice issues that you're most interested in right now? Is there like a top 5 list that you're kind of focusing on at the moment, other than climate change?
You know, I mean, fundamentally, I just live and breathe concern. You know, I fell into social justice work, I guess, if you want to call it social justice work, but I've always been sort of activistic. I've always held the belief that protest is a right, and that the only way to make a difference for an individual without a platform, especially if you are an individual, the best thing you can do in your life is to carry on the torch of dialogue, constantly keep the conversation going at the individual level. As you develop a platform, let's say as a young artist, you know, your platform is going to be through galleries, or now maybe through online and social media. And so you have a slightly larger reach, and you can't control the effectiveness of your concern. You can't control the effectiveness of your activism, right? But you can ensure that it's ongoing. And, you know, so you asked, what are my top 5? So for me, that's not really a way I would look at it. It's just in the moment on a daily basis. I'm very driven by in situ, the idea of in the moment, what is most pressing. And it's, this past year, as living in the United States of America, I just, racial relations is a very complex issue in this country. It always has been, but it is reached, it's reached a boiling point that it needed to reach. And there's a lot of sort of like politicizing going on here. And for me, I think it's been really important to get at the raw emotion and sort of emphasize the raw emotion, because it's the truth for people who are feeling that raw emotion. And so the work that I focused on a lot has been in dialogue with this raw emotion that's erupting all around the country. And, some sort of compare and contrast of the history of the problem, going back to slavery in the country, but, also how racism has just, it's this thing that happens everywhere. It's this thing that happens at all times, every day around the world. Difference is looked down upon. And, the root of the problem is what? What is the root of the problem? I mean, how can we say that the root of the problem isn't, bigotry, or isn't this sort of hyper nationalistic sense of, privilege over people who don't look like you? That if you came to power, if you have control, that, somehow you're going to maintain that control by, oppressing a particular population. There's a lot of racist, bigoted people in this country. Half the country, half the country is racist. It's terrible. So I don't know how the problem is fixed. other than it will need to be constantly addressed. So race relations has been for me a major focus for most of my adult life. And it'll be ongoing work until, I don't know if it ever ends. Certainly the world we live in, is the world that my children are inheriting is an important focus of mine. I was talking briefly about the Greta Thunberg collection, but everything's impromptu. It's hard to say that I am sort of like, have a list and I'm going to get up and today I'm going to work on this problem and tomorrow I'm going to work on it. I really don't work like that. I'm a very emotionally driven person. So whatever, I don't know. It's also part of that the artistic process, like who you are as an artist, how you work. I mean, there's a certain amount of controlled chaos in what I do. And, my drive is sort of limitless. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, it's good. It shows, well, to me at least, that you're really genuine and sincere, and like you don't have a list. You go through 1 through 5 and then restart from the top. That's how it should be. Thank you for that. Let's jump on to the art one. So last time you were saying, I'm trying to remember the quote here, that the objective of art is not to reproduce reality, but to create a reality of the same intensity or more. Have you thought about that more since we last spoke, or do you want to elaborate on what art is?
So I think what art is, if you think about the way in which art history and human history intertwine, and you go back to the beginning, like say the cave paintings that they've just recently discovered amazing 40,000, 50,000 year old. See, it's the oldest and largest collection of what we would consider as cave art, right? In the middle of the Amazon rainforest, you go back to look at how the visualized world around us came to be through the creators of the day, back when we were, hunter gatherers. It was about recording, right? It was about teaching, telling a story that could be passed along. This is, 50,000 years ago. There's a need for generational sharing, right? And so that visual record was meant as a dialogue with future generations or an existing generation. And it's also a way, I think it's important, of solidifying a permanent record and paying homage to your time and place. Like that a creator 50,000 years ago felt impassioned to put that on a wall. Its meaning was multifold. For the community, it was a record and a teaching tool. And for the individual, it was an homage to that person's life in that time and place. And there's no difference between, that hunter-gatherer doing that and us getting up on a daily basis and working to both create a record of our time and place and to pay homage to my own experience of that time and place, and to hopefully open up a platform where dialogue can happen about what's important now. And as you come through from 50,000 years ago to today, I don't see, there have been times and periods in art history where, in retrospect, culture at large had a greater influence on what was being made and how, versus times where art itself had a greater influence on culture at large. And by that I mean is, what we see throughout art history is a slow distancing from the establishment, where, in the Middle Ages, you had monarchies, you had kings, you had queens, and artists worked, if they were so lucky enough, they worked for royalty. If you were an artisan, like, Michelangelo, you were employed by the king, or you were employed by the Vatican. Art was in service to royalty. And therefore, what was respected and what was normative about art was sort of imposed. Stylistics, aesthetics, the choices that artists made were taught to them in reference to what was expected by some larger source of power, because they were going to employ you in the sense that they're going to pay you to make art. So the freedom to do something extraordinary, you had to have, a gift of talent like, Raphael or Michelangelo, El Greco. I mean, these artists were able to, through their genius, to impart something extraordinary and meaningful and necessary about the human experience. But the majority of art in those periods was governed by a process of expectation. As you come up through, the 19th century, you start to see, early instances, Odilon Radon, Van Gogh, Gauguin, the Impressionists, start to break free, and individuality, the idea of human identity being part of the absolute that art needed to be, starts to really come into the fold in the 19th century. And that completely breaks with Cézanne, who, has everything to do with what happens with Matisse and Picasso that come to be at the same time. That revolution and that relationship that was very competitive between Picasso and Matisse, going back and forth, sort of butting heads at around experimentation, right? And that, again, that's where art is defining culture at large versus culture at large defining art. And that's really the 20th century, right? With globalization, the industrial revolutions, the sort of interdependency, as that grows, the interdependency around the world, that reaches a boiling point in the last 15 years because of the internet, right? Because now we live globally with each other. You're in Japan. I'm in New York, in the United States. I mean, our relationship is as real as if we were neighbors. And the whole relationship was, came to be on the internet through social media. So now, to get back to what art is, sorry for that little tangential takeoff. To me, art is and always has been this combination of record and an access mode, a deeper access mode into necessary dialogues about the time and place, the issues of the time and place, the glories of the time and place, the pains and sufferings of the time and place. All that comes to a head in art. And in that way, art is both a record, but it's also both a great influencer on the transition from generation to generation culturally. You see the influence of pop art and how that, has pop art, Andy Warhol, in the factory mentality, the multiple print, the idea of a subtle variation on a theme. That's That begins with Andy Warhol. His legacy is that. And that is what you're seeing right now in, look, if you go to Rarible, you're going to see cyberpunks in pixelated cyberpunks, and there's going to be 2,300 of them with a subtle variation. That's Andy Warhol. Okay. That's art history, sinking its teeth into the moment. Now, does the maker of the cyberpunk or the collectible kitty know that what they're doing is a direct result of what Andy Warhol contributed to art history and to the culture at large? Probably not. But because that disseminated through the machinery of culture from Andy Warhol's conception, here we are with a dominant sort of creative category, if you will, in the NFT market. So there's relevance to that crypto kitty, there's relevance to that cypherpunk art, historically speaking, through the lineage that goes back to Andy Warhol and in pop art in general. Last thing I would say about what is art, and I think we could always talk about what is art, but my basic comment on it is a deeper access mode. If it's being, for me, if art is a deeper access mode, is a moment of entanglement between a viewer and a statement. And that entanglement will, to a greater or lesser degree, depending on the success of that work to be relatable to a particular viewer. And every viewer will bring a different level of relatability to it. But all of those differing experiences between the viewer and the work are creating the bits and pieces of a dialogue, expanding upon a dialogue, and bringing it from that viewing of that work into their other realms, into their life. And I believe that art tends to register subconsciously, oftentimes in a greater way, in a more important way than it does consciously in the moment that you're viewing a work. And if that idea that art is not an object of beauty, I don't like that. I don't like the thought of art just being an object, which is another reason why I love the NFT, because it's completely immaterial. It's a deeper access mode. And if that deeper access mode has the aesthetic look of what people consider art as an object of beauty, that's fine. But that does not make it an object of beauty absent of a platform for expanding upon necessary dialogues of our time and place.
That's a lot to digest. It's interesting. At the end there, where you're saying you try to create some entanglement, and earlier today we talked about the project for the psychology department at St. John Fisher College. The project, how long have you been thinking about that? Is that a new thing, or that you've been thinking about how art can help people for many years? Or
the source of that thought process for me goes back to an experience I had as an analog artist. There was a tragedy in Newtown, Connecticut. There was a young 20-something-year-old man with mental health issues, severe mental health issues, went into an elementary school, shot his way into an elementary school and killed 20 children about between the ages of 5 and 7, and 5 teachers. And at the time, this was 2012. At the time, my children were always big fans of, their dad being an artist. They like to go to my shows and whatnot. And my son said to me, "Dad, you should make them some art, and maybe it'll make them less sad." And it was like a beautiful moment between my son and I. And in that moment, I thought, you know what? I don't know what's going to come of this, but I'm going to follow my son's intention, and I'm going to do this. And so I took a sabbatical from work at the time and spent about 3 months developing a collection of meditations that I thought, when you think about the pain and suffering, right, of a family grieving the loss of a child in such a difficult, violent way, I thought that I wouldn't want to use like a literal depiction of the loved one who was lost. I thought it needed to be very spiritual or enchanted, in a sense that it allowed the transformation of the space of grieving, like within the concept of grief, in the context of living in a home where your child is now missing, that if there was going to be something referencing that child's life, that it should be something that was transformative and light, and brings somebody to a place of, like, pure memory, where the work itself doesn't interfere with the process of grieving or the process of seeing in memory that person who was lost. So these works, 26 of them, unfortunately, I made them all. They were all produced at the time. I produced them on copper plates, and I was using candles as a sort of active vigil for the victims. The first step in the process of making these works, again, going back to last week, referencing they were all photo documented in the end, was using a candlelight as a painting tool on the metal. And then from there, working with other things. But that being said, when it was done, I brought the collection to Newtown Town Hall, and where they had received hundreds of thousands of gifts for the families. And I said, here, I left this with them, and I got back in my car and I started driving home. And by the time I got an hour away from Newtown, driving home, I got a call from the mayor of Newtown, saying that they opened the boxes and they're overwhelmed, and they asked me if I would give them a second collection. They were going to give the work to the families, and then the second collection was going to be held permanently as the memorial for the tragedy at Newtown Town Hall, where it still today hangs on the walls as the memorial. And then I had, it was an overwhelming experience for me, because then I started receiving lots of communications and letters, just heartbreaking letters from the parents of the lost children. And I still to this day, I have some pen pal relationships with the parents of those lost children. And it was a transformative moment for me. Like, what happened as a direct response to my child's, disbelief in what happened and his belief in his father to help, just became something that I needed to keep doing. That I realized that it was genuinely possible to make a difference in individual lives, even if you don't get to be a famous artist or a super successful artist that's known everywhere. Like, that is not important. It never has been, because I don't even think of myself as an artist. I think of myself as an activist and a contributor to the dialogues, and in some way always trying to make a difference. And that was really where it stuck with me, and I haven't given up since. That it was the most important thing I could do with my life, was to just keep looking at other people's needs and trying to contribute to the solutions or possible solutions, through acts of dialogue.
It's an interesting story. And I guess it depends how you define, successful. It's not always about how many people know your name, but if you're helping people that need help, it's not much more important than that.
Yeah.
That's good. What else? I was going to ask you who has had an influence on your art, like any of the people, but I think I'll save that for next time. And we'll maybe wrap up with advice for new NFT artists. Do you have any Any tips on how people can get started or how you keep up to date? There's so many things going on in the world of NFTs. Any advice for people?
I don't think it's time yet for advice about the approach to the NFT world because it's so young. But I would say if I was giving advice to a young artist, not just an NFT artist, it's the same advice that a writer would give another writer, or an older writer would give a young writer, or an older musician would give a young musician. Voice matters. Your voice needs to be your voice. I know that's an oversimplification, but artistic identity is really about the honesty and integrity with which you're speaking to other people, whether it's visually, musically, or linguistically. That if there's an honesty, if there's an integrity, there's going to be uniqueness. And that's really you being yourself in this time and place and contributing through your lens. Again, I represent, and I'm interested in helping develop this NFT space for fine artists. The struggle to develop the NFT space for fine artists is going to be shared by many. And so the idea of the other types of creators that are here, like people into the collectibles or anime or virtual reality, video clips. I mean, everybody there's going to be a lot of, there's going to be a lot of people that are just running into the space for the money grab, and they're, copying and pasting and, doing what other people are doing. But I think for the integrity of the space, the health of the space, I hope to see, over time, everybody bringing their genuine self, to the space. And that's the most important thing I could say right now is don't think that because Bored Elon on Rarible has sold 50, ether worth of that's what you should make. Like, that's not going to develop the NFT art for in the fine artist sort of angle.
It's not sustainable anyway, right?
It's not sustainable, and ultimately it's unhealthy because you want the NFT to become as respected of a marketplace as the analog, Sotheby's. I mean, in the long run, it can be. In the long run, it's not now. Right now, it's the Wild West, and right now there's, everybody thinks it's just the next money grab, and the real work that could be done and will be done is going to be done over time. So I would just offer that as advice to anybody coming in, rather than just try to rush in and, and make a quick buck. If you are an artist, think about your identity 5 years from now, what you contribute to the space, in retrospect, that your identity shines, not that you were here, just that you were here and you played the game.
It's good advice. Okay, I think we'll wrap it up there, Henry. Thank you very much. Bye.